Hi, thanks for joining me today. Have you listened to the podcast Spend, Donate, Invest yet? I love this show. It's hosted by Gina Gimja, who goes by Gigi, and these episodes are short, sweet, and to the point of how to use our financial power, whatever that is for each of us, in ways that build the world that we want to have, one that addresses inequity in all the ways that we experience it. You can find Spend, Donate, Invest anywhere you listen to podcasts, and you can learn more about Spend, Donate, Invest at the website spenddonateInvest.world. Do you want to change the world? So do I. On this show, we meet artists whose work is doing just that. Welcome to Art Heals All Wounds. I'm your host, Pam Uzel. Have you heard? There's a new war. President wannabe governors have declared a war on wokeness. You might be forgiven if you think that wokeness is a term that gained widespread use during the early days of the Trump administration and after about 15 minutes was dropped from use by most progressives. But for these anti-woke warriors, it's so much more. Some brief examples of wokeness that are under attack are reproductive freedom, gender-affirming care, African American studies, and basically all ethnic studies, books of all kinds, drag queens reading books, unionization, and climate science. I'm sure this is not an exhaustive list, and you could come up with more to add. It's interesting to think about the intersection of the brief, widespread use of the word woke with the Trump presidency, and think about the most disturbing things from that time. Immigrants at the southern border who were supposedly rapists. A Muslim ban where travelers from certain countries were stopped from entering the U.S. Small children taken from their parents who came to the southern border seeking asylum. And then think back even further to a year before Trump, when that old, wily husk of a Senate leader blocked President Obama's rightful appointment of a Supreme Court justice. I say this as a reminder to myself that Trump didn't invent hate or political malfeasance, but his presidency certainly normalized it. And for a good number of his would-be successors, the race is on. Who can spout the most hate-filled rhetoric? I'm just so angry. And also, I'm so scared because a war against wokeness is actually a war against science, a war against medical expertise, a war against religious freedom and separation of church and state, and a war against curiosity. Worst of all, it's a war against empathy, which is why I talk to artists. And for this first episode during Women's History Month, I'm thrilled to have one of my favorite authors on the show. Ausma Zehanat Khan writes riveting detective series that incorporate the ways that rising nationalism have historically led to atrocities, and the ways in which it's sniffing at our doorsteps again. Her first detective series was set in Canada. Her latest series takes place in suburban America. Reading about characters who struggle with the everyday affronts of being Muslim in societies with increasing xenophobia, Islamophobia, and racism enables me to walk for a few hundred pages in their shoes. What better way than that to develop empathy? Thank you for listening today. Remember to follow Art Heals All Wounds in your favorite listening app, and if you feel so inclined, to leave it a 5-star review. Those reviews help the show grow, which helps me bring you more artists and the stories behind their work. Ausma Zehanat Khan is the author of Blackwater Falls, the first volume of a new crime series set in a small Colorado town. Blackwater Falls introduces us to American Muslim detective Inaya Rahman. Inaya investigates homicides in minority communities with her partners Catalina Hernandez and a civil rights attorney, Arisha Adams, a trio of Muslim, Latina, and Black investigators who work together to reform the criminal justice system as they solve a series of chilling murders. Ausma is also the author of the Isakatic Rachel Getty mystery series set in Canada. I read the first of this series, The Unquiet Dead, and I have been hooked on her work ever since. She's also the author of The Khorasan Archives, a 4-book fantasy series which is gripping and gorgeous to read. Before becoming a full-time author, Ausma practiced immigration law in Toronto. She's also taught international human rights law at Northwestern University and human rights and business law at York University. In our conversation, we talk about how this background has informed her work as a novelist. Hi, Ausma. Welcome to Art Heals All Wounds. Can you start by introducing yourself, telling us who you are and what you do?
Hi, thank you so much for having me on your show, Pam. My name is Ausma Zehanat Khan. I am a former immigration and human rights lawyer who currently writes crime fiction. I have a new series and a new book out called Blackwater Falls. Came out last November. It's set in a small town in Colorado. Previously, I wrote the Isa Khatak and Rachel Getty crime series that takes place in Canada. And I've also written a 4-book fantasy series called the Khorasan Archives.
Yes, and I love your books. Every time you have a new one out, I devour it. And before we talk about your books, I do just want to hear a little bit more about your background. So you have a PhD in international human rights law, is that right?
Yes, that's right.
And what I read about you is that you focused your PhD on military intervention and war crimes in the Balkan War. And I'm so curious to know what about that captured your attention. Why did you feel that it was important to focus on that?
I've been interested in the dissolution of the former Yugoslavia and the genocide that took place subsequently in Bosnia, in the Republic of Bosnia, ever since it happened, actually. So I'm dating myself a bit. I was a young law student at the time the war was taking place between 1992 and 1995. And I always had an interest in human rights law and international human rights law. And so at the same time that I was beginning to study these subjects and see that there is an entire corpus of law out there that addresses questions, military intervention for human protection purposes and how to stop war crimes or genocide, the reality was that on the ground, these crimes were still taking place in full view with impunity. And that was something that got me really invested and outraged, particularly as the targeted community was targeted because of their identity as Bosnian Muslims. And specifically, very horrific crimes were meted out against this population in terms of concentration camps and rape camps. And as a young Muslim woman myself, I identified with that very personally. And I wanted to know what could be done to stop it. So that's why I began to really deepen my research in that area.
It's so interesting because your first crime novel, The Unquiet Dead, which is one of the ones that takes place in Canada and features the 2 detectives, Asa, I always called him Katak, but it's Katak or how? Asa Katak, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing his name, and Rachel Getty.
His first name is Isa.
Isa.
Isa, which is the Arabic version of Jesus. And his last name is a typical Pathan or Pashtun tribal name, Khatak. But we don't have that sound in the English language, so most people just call him Katak, which is fine too.
Okay, so Isa Zehanat, I don't want to slaughter that sound, and
It's
Rachel
okay.
Getty, a duo which I love, by the way, and I wish that you were writing more books about them as well. But they're investigating a suspicious death. And it turns out that there are links, very, very strong links, to these crimes of genocide in Bosnia. And I'm wondering, when did you get the idea that this would make a great murder detective story? And you can tell a tiny bit of the story too. I want people to read these books. So, not too many spoilers, but when did you get this idea?
So I had been writing about the genocide in Bosnia for at least a decade. It was the subject of my master's thesis, of my PhD dissertation, and I had just gotten more and more invested and interested. And I had written about it in a number of ways. I had written a 500-page dissertation. My master's thesis was on the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, examining the legal basis for its operation. But mostly it was me alone in a small human rights library in Ottawa, the capital of Canada, going through. Back then, everything wasn't on the internet. So I would be reading statements from the Security Council, the UN Security Council, as they came out, and particularly statements from the Bosnia's representative to the UN. And these were really touching, poignant, dramatic, painful statements that to me almost read like a kind of poetry. For example, I once read the line, it was calling for urgent UN action, much like we see in Syria and Ukraine today. And the line simply said, "On Tuesday, there will be no bread in Sarajevo." And after I had graduated and gone into legal practice and done some other work, teaching and so on, I still felt that I hadn't written enough about the subject for someone with my specialized level of knowledge, and that there had to be another way to communicate the scope and horror of these crimes as time passed. We've passed the 25th anniversary now of the Srebrenica massacre. And so I thought, I've been a lifelong reader of crime fiction. I've always written fiction on the side. And I always approach my books thematically anyway, about the subject matter or the theme that I want to write about, which in this case was the pursuit of justice and what that might look like to different communities, disadvantaged communities, less privileged communities. So then I thought, this would be a good way to approach it, particularly because Isa Khatak is a Muslim detective of South Asian background. So he's someone very much like myself, and he's heading up a unit in Toronto called Community Policing, which is meant to investigate sensitive crimes in minority communities and to represent the needs of those communities, as well as representing law enforcement to those communities. So in the story, The Unquiet Dead, the first novel I wrote, Isa and Rachel are investigating. They're asked by a war crimes historian to investigate the death of a man named Christopher Drayton. Sorry, it's been a long time since I wrote the book. Named Christopher Drayton, and he's supposedly fallen from a cliff. But the question is, did he commit suicide? What was he pushed? And why would this be a case for CPS? And then as Isa and Rachel begin to dig into his background, they find that he is a fugitive war criminal from Bosnia, and the case starts to open up from there.
It's an amazing book. It's such an amazing read. It's very haunting. And for people like myself who, the Balkan War feels like it's so far in the past, it's so worthy of another look and digging in deeper and really grappling with what happened there. So I love that book. All of your books feature characters who are really doing these very, very challenging balancing acts between who they are in the society they live in, their relationship with family, being in law enforcement as someone from a historically disadvantaged community, and even Rachel Getty, who is not Muslim, is in many ways doing this same balancing act. So it's very interesting the way you write. And I do want to take this idea into your newest crime series. The first book is called Blackwater Falls. And tell us about the setting of this book.
So I've been living in Colorado since 2008. And initially, I lived closer to the city center, the University of Denver, where my husband teaches. But then we moved out into the suburbs, which was a very different experience, into a small town that mostly votes Republican. It's sort of on the border of the foothills, so we're not far from backcountry and people who love to go hiking in the mountains. And I live surrounded by mega churches. So it's not a very multicultural environment. It's quite homogenous, but it's been really interesting to me to observe the political climate here and the impact it has on minority communities, and also to see what a strong role the church plays here in Colorado. So in my new book, Blackwater Falls, it's also about a small unit. It's kind of like a hate crimes unit in a way. And what they handle is essentially hate crimes or things of that nature, community sensitive investigations. And the story opens with this unit being called on to investigate the murder of a teenage refugee from Syria. And what's unique in the case is that her body is found mounted to the door of the local mosque in a gruesome emulation of the crucifixion. So we're in this small town that's policed by a local sheriff who's deemed to be corrupt for a number of reasons. And the sheriff, along with his deputies, consistently harasses minority communities, such as the immigrant Somali workers, for example, who work at the local meatpacking plant. And they are, in addition to harassment and intimidation, when various communities, minority communities, report that they have issues and that they need help from the police, they're over-policed and underserved. So into this volatile mixture come these three detectives from community policing again. And my lead detective is a Muslim woman by the name of Inaya Rahman. She's an American, and her father is from Afghanistan. Her mother is from Pakistan. And she's partnered with a Latina detective by the name of Catalina Hernandez. So you'd think these detectives are uniquely placed to understand the problems that these communities are facing with law enforcement and to take the investigation, the murder of a teenage refugee, very seriously. So it's basically, I set the cat among the pigeons and watched the powder keg explode.
That's such an amazing way to put it. And I just want to add that you're writing about both these detectives and the various immigrant communities that they are trying to serve. It's so nuanced because it shows even sort of like a stratification there as well. And again, not too many spoilers, but there is a case around missing and murdered girls and which ones get attention and which ones don't. I don't know if you want to say anything about that or if you're wary of giving spoilers, but
I don't think it's a spoiler to talk about it because I wrote this book during the pandemic, and I got the idea to write it because I've been observing, as I said, the political climate here in Colorado, but also throughout the United States. I'm now an American citizen, but I came here as a Canadian, so I had that kind of outsider status of trying to understand the American political mind and how it affects society and society-state relations and race relations, particularly, which are so volatile in this country, which was a very different experience for me as a Canadian. It's not that we don't have racism, it's just that we hide it more and we're more polite about it. Whereas in America, I find that it's very direct and confrontational, and it's not something you can hide from. So we'd come to this kind of, I guess, we were in this crucible, and we'd come to this moment where the whole nation caught fire, where we saw the filming of the murder of George Floyd, and then the Black Lives Matter protests and the nationwide protests that sprang up in response. And we had this very divisive political commentary where, depending on the color of your skin or your social class, you had a very different impression of the role of the police and how police related to or investigated minority communities or communities of color. Minority is a phrase we use often in Canada, which I know is not that common here. And as all of this discourse was coming out, I thought about what we think about policing and why we so often try to make excuses for police brutality and police violence. And we say it's just a few bad apples rather than any kind of systemic injustice. So I wanted to address that question. I was also really interested in the political response to caravans of asylum seekers at the southern border. And that's why I introduced the character of Catalina, because she'd previously run her own NGO helping the undocumented. And again, the rhetoric around these issues was so divisive, so violent, so brutalizing towards these communities. And then finally, the years of the Trump presidency were also the years of the Muslim ban. So all of these things seem to me to be coming together in this political moment in the United States, creating this very volatile and overly sensitive climate of race relations that we couldn't ignore and that we had to do something about. And that thematically, that's what I wanted to write about. Criminal justice reform, race relations. So I decided to invent this unit, very much like a hate crimes unit called community policing, and have them investigate these kinds of crimes. And in this case, it's two women inside the police force and a Black civil rights attorney named Arisha Adams is the third lead character. And they kind of build these bonds together as Arisha comes to them and says, well, fine, you're here to investigate the death of Razan al-Qadr, this Syrian refugee, because she's white-skinned, and it's a case that's taking, national importance. But did you know that Black girls have already gone missing from this community, and neither the sheriff nor you have done anything about it? And so we see how different communities are prioritized by the police, and then we see how these different communities interact with each other while they're all working on the front lines of their various social justice struggles. So I like to write these kind of lighthearted books and delve deep into the themes that I've just explained here.
But they are also have all of the other types of drama that create a good story. There's always romantic and sexual tension between various characters. And as I said before, there's family drama, and there are a lot of personal things that each of these characters is also struggling with. And I want to go back to Inaya, who I would say is really the lead character, at least in Blackwater Falls. She is this detective. She's Muslim. She's from a Muslim family with, even within her parents, there's different ideas of the expectations for her, how her job is viewed with other community members. She's told at one point she's on the wrong side of, I guess, law enforcement or this issue, and that she along with other characters, which is a repeated theme from the Issa Katak and Rachel Getty novels, is that trying to change the system from the inside. And I think that's a really just interesting conflict-laden premise for any kind of book that also deals with these wider issues that you're talking about. So I'm really curious. I do want to explore the ways that Inaya is both an outsider and an insider in this book.
I mean, that's a great observation and great questions. I think the ways in which she's an insider, or which she thinks she's an insider, is that because she's Muslim, she thinks that she fits into the local Muslim community, that she can understand their pain at a murder that very much looks like a hate crime, because she herself has experienced prejudice and discrimination and even violence because of her identity as a Muslim woman. And at one point in her life, she was visibly Muslim because she wore a headscarf. So in that sense, she feels she's on the inside, that she understands the needs of the community, and that she's the perfect person to respond to them as an investigating officer. But in another way, she's also on the outside, both in law enforcement and in her community, because her community is naturally fearful and suspicious of law enforcement. American Muslims have been heavily scrutinized by the security apparatus of the state, maybe less so by police, but we've had a lot of engagement with FBI and so on, and in very negative ways post 9/11. So there's that worry, that sense that from the community, that if you're on the side of the police or law enforcement, and you're certainly not on the inside, you can't be one of us because you're already viewing us through the lens of power and privilege, a lens that we don't share. Then in terms of the police, she comes to the police from a background basically, I guess, analogous to internal affairs. And she used to work in a big police department in Chicago, where she was a lawyer working for the Civilian Office of Police Accountability, which is basically investigating police violence. And that's a real arm of the Chicago Police Department, which is probably one of the most problematic police departments in the country in terms of violence against Black and Latinx communities. So she comes from that background, and she's essentially fled to policing in this small town where she's just been doing things like community fairs and expos, nothing really that utilizes her skills as a lawyer or as a police officer until she's assigned to this case. And so she has a lot of experience, but does she really fit in law enforcement? Well, her experiences from Chicago would suggest no. And I had done a lot of research on police officers of color because I was interested in this question of how they reconcile these two very different identities, being privileged and then not holding privilege, particularly when the state has a monopoly on the use of force. And I had seen one of two extremes. There were people who thought that they could change the system from the inside, and that if they weren't there speaking to and representing their communities, then police treatment of those communities would be even harsher than it already is. And those people were working with good intentions, in good faith, not blind to the flaws in the system, but really honestly believing they could make a difference. Then there was the other extreme where people, like we saw it in the recent case in Memphis, where the Black kid who was murdered by police officers, beaten and murdered by police officers, those police officers were Black. And so then you say, oh, well, then police violence isn't an issue of racism. But in fact, there are those police officers who are now power adjacent and then become, in order to fit completely in the system, that's the primary identity that they assume, that closeness to whiteness, and they emulate those norms to access power and privilege. And so they too, it doesn't matter what the color of their skin is, because they're going to do the same things that whiteness does. So there are police officers who realize they have to distance themselves from their skin color, their ethnic heritage, because being in police is a different kind of brotherhood. It's that thin blue line, and they want to belong, and they want to have that power and those privileges. And you see that in the case of the Black police officer who was treated as a hero for stopping, for the part he played. I believe his name is Eugene Goodman, but I'm not sure. The part he played in the insurrection of January 6th. So, he began, everyone said, here's this Black police officer who did a magnificent job of saving lives. And then I think he was on social media somewhere holding up a thin blue line police flag. And then I saw Black communities responding to that and saying, well, then see, he is power adjacent. He's not Black like us. He's blue like them. So these were nuances of identity inside policing and inside communities of color that I wanted my characters to be able to explore. And because these issues are so layered and complex, no pun intended, they're not black and white, I thought having no one be entirely good or entirely bad, depending on whether they're inside or outside the police force, was the right way to tackle that in a book of this complexity.
Right, right. And it's so interesting too, because in all of your books, there are these huge issues of trust that come from that outsider insider tension. And even as a reader, this is early in the book, so I don't think it'll be a spoiler. We know there's an informant coming out of this unit. And boy, as a reader, at least you're like, oh my gosh, who is it? And you start trying to imagine, okay, who is this? And what does that do in terms of trust? But even without that, it is this thing between trying to fit in. Also, always in your books, people have secrets or things that they don't want to reveal, which adds another really great layer of tension to everything. You said much, much earlier when you were talking that this idea of being in a place with the megachurch, and in Blackwater Falls, there's a really, really interesting collection of power players. There's a megachurch. There are weapons manufacturers. There's a meat packing plant. And I feel like that is such a perfect trio to, again, bring up the tension and conflict that you might find in this community. On the one hand, places like meat packing plants usually hire from the immigrant population there, and they actually need them in order to do these jobs. On the other hand, you have real xenophobia that can be coming out of these types of churches, and Islamophobia, racism, without being really specific. It's a primarily white megachurch. And then you have these weapons manufacturers who are in fact creating weapons that are being used to prevent people trying to come into this country as immigrants. So I would just love to hear more about your planning process when you're thinking, oh, it would be good to have this player in here and this player in here. What were you thinking when you added kind of these three structures of power in there? There may be more, but those are the ones that I'm remembering.
I was reflecting what I've seen in terms of where I live in Colorado, and I wanted to write a very Colorado kind of book, really immersed in the setting here. So the setting, in terms of geography, there's the Chatfield Reservoir, there's the Rampart Range, and it gives you the idea that there's this kind of there's this little town that's surrounded by mountains, it's closed in, and it's a small place where the power players have to interact with each other continually. And one of the big stories in Colorado while I was living here was a story about the meatpacking plant in Greeley. And what had happened to them was that when ICE and the Border Patrol had begun expanding their raids, they basically raided their Latin workforce and deported them. So then they had to bring in new workers. And because of the refugee program, there were many Somali and other immigrants, typically Muslim immigrants, Afghan, Syrian, who were now working in the plant. And the plant was making accommodations for them in terms of the month of Ramadan, so they could fast and then pray, and giving them prayer space. And then there was pushback against those things from other employees that created this kind of perfect moment where you could see the flashpoint between different communities having rights and not having rights and accommodation. And despite the fact that the plant very much needed these workers, and as we know, in meatpacking plants, those are very dangerous places to work. So there's an exploitation factor as well, and that's why there's a whole storyline about unionization. In order to protect themselves, these vulnerable refugee and immigrant workers are trying to unionize, and that poses a danger to the plant owners. And then, of course, Lockheed Martin, the arms and munition aerospace giant, is one of the major employers in the state of Colorado. So I was saying, and when we first moved to the suburb, my husband is of Iranian background and also looks very Arab. So we had accidentally driven up to a secure facility for Lockheed Martin, which was guarded by a barbed wire gate and a watchtower. And only as we'd gotten close to the gate did we see the big flashing sign saying, "Warning, this is Lockheed Martin. Proceed no further or you'll be prosecuted." And the watchtower had, guards with guns. And I was like, this is not a good place for two brown people and one Arab-looking person to be driving up to. And it was always in the back of my mind that, what does it mean for a society when one of the major employers, they're all working on arms and munition? And now, of course, now that America is not fighting as many foreign wars, they considered the war is at the southern border. So they're trying to adapt this technology to keep Latinx people out of this country, essentially. So that was a big element. I thought that had to be played up because it's very Colorado and it's very American, this idea of, multi-million, sometimes billion-dollar contracts being awarded to arms and munition companies for the specific purpose of treating asylum seekers as a threat similar to the enemy in a war. It just says something about how we perceive our neighbors, how we perceive destitute people. How in this country, I think it was in Arizona and New Mexico, they had criminalized the giving of water to the undocumented coming across the border. And so a person who had human feelings and saw somebody was starving or dying of thirst in the desert, wanted to give them water, they could be arrested for that. And I thought that was a very interesting element of the American psyche to start exploring, particularly as I live, very close to Lockheed Martin. And what was the third element? So I've talked about the
megachurch.
Oh, the megachurch. Yes. So I am surrounded by megachurches, which is coming as a Canadian, which is again, a very secular kind of country because it has so much diverse religious practice, and religion is not really the language of the state. So it was really interesting to me to see how important religion is in American politics and society. And I'd been following these various evangelists online and listening to their sermons. So the language of the sermons in the book is very closely aligned to real life, to really strong Islamophobic rhetoric and this kind of Sharia law panic that swept the United States, where I think some 30 states enacted anti-Sharia legislation when absolutely nobody had been calling for Sharia law to be implemented anywhere. And it's just a question of how propaganda and demonization can so effectively change the minds of people about a particular community, panic them, make them fear. And of course, the whole strategy is you don't look at who's actually depriving you of income and rights and so on by making you focus on an external enemy. In many cases, American Muslims are that enemy, the fifth column. So having seen those sermons and being surrounded by these churches, I thought, let's put it all together in this small town, watch these characters interact, and hopefully in the process be able to say something about the political and cultural moment that we're in.
Yeah. And when you just talk about the panic over Sharia law, in the meantime, fundamentalist Christianity is now dictating a lot of our laws.
And depriving women of their reproductive rights, endangering their health.
Yeah, really laser focused on women's rights, LGBTQ rights. Just, it is frightening. What I wanted to ask you about is that you so often in your work really beautifully recall places where multiculturalism flourished in terms of the former Yugoslavia, in terms of you talk about Andalusia in that same book. And you also talk about this sort of warning signs, kind of the steps of how we go from that to violence and one group essentially stamping out multiculturalism by enacting violence on other groups. So I'm wondering what those steps are, and you kind of said them, but what are you seeing in the US currently that makes you really want to bring these issues to the forefront in your work?
That's a great and deeply layered question that on this one question, I could speak for an hour. But just to get back to the Unquiet Dead and why I wrote about Bosnia so much, in many ways, in the research that I did, I would often see political commentators, public intellectuals, scholars, and Bosnians themselves talk about Bosnian society before the genocide as an example of the new European Enlightenment, in the sense that in Bosnia, Catholics, Orthodox Christians, Jews, and Muslims lived together peacefully for centuries, that 1/4 of the population was intermarried. So the families had blended and they were existing very peacefully before the ultra-nationalist movements that came out of Serbia with Milosevic and then were in the Republika Srpska under Karadzic. So that was kind of a rhetoric and a propaganda that was very deliberately manufactured and manipulated to treat Bosnian Muslims as the outsider Turks rather than an indigenous community that was intermixed, intermarried in a society that was multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and living without conflict. And so to get to your question, what are the steps along the way? I often say in my talks and sometimes in my books too, that genocide is never the beginning. It's always the end point. And what you're looking at, I think, I'm not suggesting that American society is genocidal, but as you move from democracy to authoritarianism, what you look at is often in political science, it's called gradualism, but the term that I use is incrementalism. Thousands of tiny steps, a little at a time, that move the center to the right and that make political discourse mainstream and acceptable. That was absolutely on the lunatic fringe in all the time up until now. So, the idea of being able to safely talk about a Muslim ban in society, like we just take that as so normal when it's actually an unthinkable proposition. So little steps like this, the anti-Sharia panic, the decision to refuse Muslim communities permits to build mosques or Muslim cemeteries. If you look at the nation of France, for example, the idea, or even Canada in our French-Canadian province, Quebec, the idea that Muslim women who, out of their religious belief, wear a headscarf are banned from serving in public education and public service, that girls who typically, as part of their dress code, wear a long skirt are required not to wear a long skirt to show their body. They are not allowed to wear body covering clothing on a public beach. So you're disenfranchising an entire segment of citizens. And if the rest of the population is comfortable with that and lets those laws continue ad nauseum, you will eventually get to a place where you've not only singled out a minority, but you've completely demonized them and made it acceptable to take away all of their civil rights and their human rights. So I think you have to watch for those signs. To me, it's not unthinkable that there could be a mass internment program here for various communities. If you're willing to deport the undocumented, deny dreamers a path to citizenship, if legal immigration is so difficult, so long-term, and so expensive that it's out of the reach of most people, then you're already making moves to privilege some groups in society and demonize other groups in society. But you're doing it in this incremental, gradual way where you break down the civic institutions in society, where you have an insurrection and everyone involved in that insurrection, including the leading politicians, aren't immediately prosecuted. All of that stuff is becoming normalized. And that's something that is called conditioning. You're conditioning a population to accept it. And if you don't have checks on truth in your news, for example, you don't have an independent body that verifies what's coming out of radio and podcasts and television is actually accurate and factual, then you're in the process also of disinforming your citizenry. So an uneducated, misinformed, disinformed citizenry, coupled with these moves to disenfranchise members of society through legal means, all of this is incrementalism or gradualism that can lead you to a state where it's perfectly acceptable that an entire group be stripped of rights. And I think that's what we are seeing, this process of gradualism in American politics today, where we are not defending the institutions, the key institutions of democracy, as vigorously and as forcefully as we can with all the legal means at our disposal.
Yes. Yes.
I'm always the person you want at a dinner party for lighthearted conversation, because these thoughts are always brewing at the back of my mind.
Well, you should come to one of my dinner parties because you'd be right at home.
That's good to hear.
Yeah, so many things were flashing through my mind as you were talking about what's become normalized. I mean, of course, the biggest thing that flashed through my mind, two biggest ones, are this loss of reproductive rights and also children being taken away from their mothers at the border as a form of deterrence. The fact that so many people in power try to spin that as something acceptable.
When it's unspeakably cruel, and when both the Border Patrol and the ICE operate as independent organizations with virtually no oversight. So we don't actually know what's happening to those children in custody or women in custody. We don't know what infractions are being carried out against them, whether sexual violence is rampant, whether child exploitation or trafficking is rampant. As long as there's no oversight, people can commit any kind of crime against vulnerable and defenseless people with impunity. And that to me is truly terrifying, that we're okay looking away from all that.
Right. Well, I think we could talk for hours.
I think so too.
The main thing I want to leave people with is that, yes, you, Ausma Zehanat Khan, can talk about all these things at the same time that you are creating page turners. Because as I said, I just devoured them. I fell in love with, the characters. I felt like Rachel Getty was potentially going to be my new best friend. And, now I'm sort of building my relationship with Inaya. So I know already that your books are very widely read, and I hope that even more people read them. Can you tell us where people can find out more about your work and where to find your books?
Thank you very much for those kind words. I have a website, ausmazehanatKhan.com. You can find my books pretty much everywhere: Amazon, Barnes & Noble, bookshop.org. And on my website, I have links. I'm on Twitter as Ausma Zehanat, on Instagram and Facebook as AZ Khan Books, and on Facebook as Ausma Zehanat Khan. And I love to interact with my readers, so never hesitate to drop me a line on any of those platforms. And I'll look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for making time to talk to me about this, because these are all things that I thought, I would love to ask her about this. So thanks for finally giving me the chance.
Thank you so much for having me on the show and asking me questions of such great insight and complexity. I appreciate it.
You're listening to Art Heals All Wounds. Wow, I'm really grateful to Ausma Zehanat Khan for being a guest on today's episode. Blackwater Falls, her latest book, is published by Minotaur Books and can be found at booksellers everywhere. You can find links on where to buy it on Ausma's website, which is ausmazehanatKhan.com. I'll include links in the show notes. And thank you so much for listening. Remember to follow and rate this show on your favorite listening app. And you can always reach me through my website, arthealsallwoundspodcast.com. The music you've heard in this podcast is by Ketsa and Lobo Loco. This podcast was edited by Eva Hristova. As always, this show was recorded using Squadcast FM. Art Heals All Wounds comes to you from Oakland, California, on unceded territory of the Choqueño Ohlone people.